All right. Good evening and welcome to Well Read, the University Library series, which brings amazing authors to you, and that's authors with Carolina ties. My name is Elaine Westbrooks. I'm the Vice Provost and University Librarian at Carolina, and I can't tell you how excited I am for tonight. We will hear from my friend and colleague, Dr. Patricia Parker. She's professor of critical organizational communication studies. She's chair of the communication department at UNC Chapel Hill. She's a director of the graduate certificate in participatory research. She also is beginning a 4-year term as a director of the Institute of Arts and Humanities at UNC, and that begins in July of this year. She currently serves as the co-chair of the University Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward. She's also the inaugural director of faculty diversity initiatives for the university's College of Arts and Sciences. Patricia is the founder and executive director of Ella Baker Women's Center for Leadership and Community Activism, a community-based organization. Her work has been recognized with numerous awards, including the university's Diversity Award in 2014. Pat will be joined in conversation by Monica Figueroa. Monica is the interim librarian for inclusive excellence in the university libraries. She's co-chair of the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Council. And in 2020, Monica was also awarded the university's Diversity Award. So, and I just want to make sure I actually named the title of the book that we'll be talking about today. And the title is Ella Baker's Catalytic Leadership, a primer on community engagement and a communication for social justice. So Pat and Monica, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I look forward to a really great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Hi, Pat.
Monica.
I'm so excited to be in conversation with you this evening. It's such a great opportunity to talk with you about your work and about Ella Baker. I also have my copy here, well loved. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. As we get started, I think it's really only fitting to begin our conversation talking about Ella Baker, her grassroots leadership and social justice activism. As you allude to in your book, Black women leaders like Ella Baker and Septima Clark and Rosa Parks, leaders of the civil rights movement, were so often left at the margins of history, even though their behind the scenes and grassroots work was vital to the movement. And your book, and I quote you here, it builds on the new visibility of Baker's work and pushes back against the persistent invisibility and erasure that still characterize Black women's and girls' leadership and activism. So I was thinking with that in mind, I wonder if we might hear from you a bit about your background, your work and your scholarship, and also the work and legacy of Ella Baker and how those two things connect and what drew you to Baker's community engagement philosophy in thinking about catalytic social justice leadership.
Well, Monica, first let me just say what a pleasure it is to be here today to be a part of this wonderful tradition of the library hosting Well Read. I know that I'm among several wonderful authors, so it's just a privilege for me to be here. And thanks to Elaine, my friend and colleague, for the invitation, and for you for being my interlocutor here. So yeah, let me start by saying that I discovered Ella Baker when I was doing research for my first book, which was focused on African-American women's leadership. I am, as Elaine mentioned, I'm a scholar of organizational communication. I think about questions about power and race and organizing and gender and other identities, and as it's connected to organizing. And so that's when I discovered sort of the centrality of Ella Baker to my work. But I do want to take your question at on its face and tell you about sort of how I began this journey. I'm the youngest of 13 from a large family in Arkansas. I begin there because it is there that I first, I think I started to understand how community is so central to my own identity and the way that I engage with the world, because I was basically born into a little mini organization, right? This was in the rural South in Arkansas. And I've written about this in a couple of pieces that I've published, that I started to, I actually was born in an era in which I was a part of the desegregation of schools back in, so Central High School, which is a sort of an iconic event, the desegregation of Central High School, happened in 1957. I was born in 1958. And so by third grade, it was not until third grade that I went through that experience of desegregation. But it was through that experience that I started to see this sort of contradiction in my own experience, right? So having been born into this loving family and a wonderful community where I saw people working together, and understood that there was just so much love there. And then going into a kind of historically white institution, environment, even as an 8-year-old, seeing those contradictions. And so I started to understand this sort of have this critical consciousness about how the personal is political, right? Like how your personal experience may be in contradiction to the reality. And so then starting to develop these questions. So fast forward, going to the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my PhD, I was introduced to these French philosophers and also Black feminist writers. And I started to get sort of a theoretical frame of how these questions about being in community and living through contradictions becomes a way of thinking about these larger questions about leadership and participatory leadership. So as I began to think about that, I did my dissertation, in which I interviewed several 15 very prominent senior executives, some who were prominent in government and politics, others in corporate environments, Black women who were really at the top, senior leaders in their field. And each of them talked about this engagement with community. Yeah. And so I started to think about a tradition of African-American women's leadership, of Black women's leadership, that's grounded in this idea of community engagement, of working through contradictions. And these women who are in these complex organizations had done that. So as I turned the dissertation into a book, my first book, I started to see that this was precisely what Ella Baker was doing in the Jim Crow South as she was engaging as the first female director of branches for the NAACP back in the 1930s and 40s. Right. In the 1940s, she saw the power of people who were working in their communities, who, like me as an 8th grader, I'm not trying to diminish these valiant people, but people can see these contradictions and they develop wisdom and knowledge about how oppression is showing up and how, and what it looks like to lead from that perspective. And so in her brilliance, she developed this approach of engaging, lifting up the stories of the people who were living through this and sort of connecting that to a philosophy of change. So that's how I came to Ella Baker's work. And I do want to add, Monica, that my work definitely has a historical analysis. And I rely a lot on historians, but I'm not a historian. So I do want to call out Barbara Ransby, who is at the University of Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago, I should say. and wrote I think the definitive biography of Ella Baker. So I encourage people to get Barbara's book, and also Charles Payne, who wrote a wonderful book about the organizing tradition in Mississippi, and really centered Ella Baker and Septima Clark as sort of outstanding, sort of unsung sheroes, right, of the civil rights movement.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Pat. Thinking about how this leadership develops through practice. You talk about this, like it happens through practice and in the midst of struggle. And throughout your book, you lay out these 3 commitments that are needed to realize catalytic social justice leadership.
Yes.
And these commitments, for the folks who haven't picked up Pat's book yet, which although you should, the first is commitment to community power. The second is commitment to group-centered leadership. And then the third is a commitment to exposing the workings of structural power. And you sort of talk about these commitments coming together through critical communication practices. And I wondered if we could just talk a little bit about one of those practices, in particular, radical listening. I thought that the section on listening to silences was really, really interesting, and it resonated with me in so many ways. And yeah, what does that look like in practice? What does it mean to listen to silences? What did that mean for Ella Baker to listen to silences?
Sure. Well, the short response is that you are listening to what is not said, right? But I want to give some context to that. If I want to sort of think about this, as you know, the subtitle of my book is this primer on community engagement and communication for social justice, and it's about thinking about, in particular, people like me in universities, right, or anyone coming from outside of a community that has access to particular resources,
right.
Engaging with people in communities where there often is, sort of a differential power arrangement, right? Where there's access to some resources and communities, often it's fewer resources. But in particular for universities going into communities and people in vulnerable communities, in that context, there is, there becomes this sort of these obstacles to the community voice, even if we're intentional. And I think, the University of North Carolina is, in some regards, has been at the forefront with our School of Public Health. And then, as I am the director of a certificate on participatory research,
Right.
leaders in these tools for creating partnerships. But I submit in this book that even when we are intentional about creating those partnerships, there are obstacles that come into play that prevent community voice from happening. And so developing that capacity to interpret what it means when, for example, in my case, we were partnering with girls in subsidized housing and a neighborhood that I'd gotten to know the girls and their families. What does it mean when a girl doesn't show up for a meeting? We're planning, we've got meetings, we've got a partnership, we've got this project going, and then they're not showing up here, or they're not showing up there. There are certain approaches to those kinds of just practical projects where you can make all sorts of assumptions, and, set up sort of these sort of power dynamics where the girls are they're not seen in all of their complexities. And so what we tried to do in our work, and what I've talked about in the book, is what it means to listen to silences is to listen to all of the complexities that people bring in these situations and into our work. And I have, there are a couple of vignettes in the book where we talk about that. One of our very first projects, we talk about this, what is referred to as the dumpster project. It was a project that the girls really had talked about as one that was a source of conflict in the department, and rather in the community. It involved the sort of city officials of had all the hallmarks of an activist project. Like, this is something that the community identified as a problem, and we could benefit from supporting them and sort of working to bring about change. But it was the way that we approached that problem with the girls, the fact that we saw it as, hey, this is us fighting City Hall, in which the girls in the beginning had, they said it was a problem, but they weren't clear about whether they wanted to move forward with that. And so that was a lesson learned, because we moved forward without fully understanding how the girls saw this as impacting their parents, first of all, how that was all tied up with questions about their vulnerability as, living in subsidized housing and those sorts of things. And so myself, as someone who comes from elite university, but also, as I've just mentioned, I grew up in an impoverished rural community. I felt like I had, sort of that perspective of being able to listen and to see and to hear. But even in that context, we missed some cues. We had some missteps. And people have given me feedback, and that this is part of the value of this book, is being able to show my own vulnerability of doing this work. And I'm happy to report that from that first misstep, it became sort of this opportunity to create something that was much more meaningful to the girls and to the community. And it just catalyzed our work for the rest of the time that we were there.
Yeah. I'm so happy you brought up that misstep, right? Like, it's when we read these sort of books, and it's, everything has to be polished and we can't talk about our mistakes, but there are going to be mistakes. And you sort of talk about that a little bit towards the end of the book, where they're like, this is progressive. There are steps, right? And you may have to step back. You may have to rethink. You may have to pivot. And that's what catalytic leadership is about too, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's really at the heart of this book. This book is about learning to be in a participatory relationship,
right?
In a context in which there's unequal power. It just is situated with, there's unequal power just circulating throughout the partnership, and just being tenaciously committed to, having those who are in the most vulnerable position, those who are most impacted by the thing that you're doing, to be in the leadership. I mean, that was, I think, the elegance of Miss Baker's approach, and it's why there's so many people. I mean, even in the Black Lives Matter movement now, and so many other movements that once they discover Ella Baker's approach and her belief in community power, and sort of how that's tied to sort of these anti-racist philosophies and traditions. People really, it resonates with current, contemporary activists. So at the heart of this is this idea of being tenaciously tied to community power, and what that looks like, to step back to let communities lead.
That reminds me of the quote that you start each book chapter with a quote of Ella Baker, and the one that's "people under the heels of oppression should be the ones leading," is so illustrative of what it means to thoughtfully and intentionally enter into community with folks who are oppressed, right? Like, in thinking about the Leadership Center and Striving Sisters Speak, You have this question about participative spaces. And I wonder if we could talk about that a bit in relation to activism within the workplace. So the question that I was particularly drawn to on page 14 was, what would truly participative spaces look like where productive knowledge could emerge from all angles? We were just sort of talking about that when talking about the community engagement project that you did with the girls, and thinking about how that might translate to a community within a workplace environment. As someone who is organizing and leading these sort of social justice conversations.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I appreciate you asking that question, because this is something that I am committed to as someone who is an organizational leader. I'm in a workplace here. I chair a department, and I previously was, as Elaine mentioned in my bio, the inaugural director of faculty diversity initiatives, and that was from 2012 to 2015, and that was really my first opportunity to apply this philosophy of organizing, catalyzing leadership in the workplace. I had my nonprofit, I founded that in 2007. And so I had really been working with the girls. I've been working in communities. So I had this sort of, and it was just prior to getting the book launch written. So having that opportunity to step into that role as director of faculty diversity initiatives and immediately engage and create a network of diversity leaders. So I had that, I was given that opportunity. I mean, it was just, there was a task force that said, we'll have a director and we'll have these diversity liaisons in each department in the College of Arts and Sciences. I mean, so at that time we had, there are about 72 academic units, but we had about 40 departments where the dean had appointed diversity liaisons there. And so I had this opportunity to really test out something that Ms. Baker had as a central part of her approach. And that is that whenever you enter into this kind of social justice work and you enter into communities, your first order of business is to find out who is already doing the work.
Right.
Don't assume that when you go into a community and you're thinking about sort of the vulnerabilities, you know how as academics we're great at this. Like, we know how power works. We know how, sort of extreme capitalism is circulating to create these conditions and so forth. We've got it all figured out.
Right.
But Ella Baker, what Ella Baker taught us is that as she went into the Jim Crow South, the people who were living through this sort of terror situations, that there are people who are working and have an analysis on how to have this analysis of what the power structure is, what it looks like to resist. And so I applied that same philosophy with the diversity liaisons. Many of the people who, they raised their hands to say, I will be a diversity liaison. These are the people who had already been toiling in their departments, often the lone voice to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, here's a way to connect, more formally with the dean's office and so forth. So I really took advantage of that and loved creating that network and talking with people who were doing this work and learning from them, learning about what works in their discipline, because the sciences are different from the arts, are different from the humanities. And so learning from them about what is the knowledge that they've already created there, and then how do we connect that to the larger project. And I'm happy to say that the diversity liaisons are still in existence. And I just think that's sort of the, that's the foundation of doing social justice and equity work, is to have these networks of community leaders
Yeah.
In the book, I talk about bridge leaders.
Right. I was going to say this concept of bridge leadership. I thought it was so powerful to think about how you move into community with people, right? There are already people leading in these communities, have, their finger on the pulse, all of the stuff that we talk about, and really tapping into that leadership to, move work forward.
To move forward and catalyze that. I mean, that's, I think that's really an important aspect of how change happens, right? Is providing the resources to people who are already doing the work. And then, but, I tell my students when I teach graduate students, and there's so many wonderful scholars and graduate students who are doing community engaged work and participatory work. And my graduate seminars, I talk about the fact that when we go into communities, we go in with an open mind, but we don't go in with an empty mind. And that's actually a quote, and I can give anybody that's not an original quote. That was the scholar escapes me at this moment, but I will find it and I can get it to you.
That's a great quote.
It is, right? Which is to say that we have to figure, what is it, how can we support, but we bring our own expertise.
Right.
And there are, in the book, I talk about entering communities. In that chapter where, people under the hills of living on the hills of oppression should be the ones leading.
Yeah. That's
a part of that. Now, once I had at a book talk, I had someone say, hey, wait a minute, but people who are under the hills of oppression are always the ones who have to sort of step up, or they're thinking about, right? And so it's not that.
Right.
It's not that. It is not shirking our responsibilities of, we have to do our own work of this critical consciousness to see what we bring to the table and are truly in partnership with people who are in these vulnerable situations, life situations, and working on the project where we're all complicit and implicated, I should say, in finding a way forward through the as power starts to reassert itself, and it implicates all of us, and each of us has our work to do.
Yes, so true, Pat. Before I ask my next question, I do want to remind folks that the Q&A box is open, so please do feel free to submit your questions there. Thinking about stories of resistance and storytelling, I wonder if we could talk about the community festival. That was the sort of pivot that was taken after the dumpster project didn't quite take off. And thinking about collectivity and collective action and community power, and the way that project and that festival really, it was an opportunity for folks to share and create a counter narrative, right, of the way that neighborhoods are talked about, the way that people are talked about, and particularly, Black and brown folks, right? So I wonder, I would just like to hear more about the festival and what that meant for folks to do this sort of storytelling resistance work.
Yes. Well, that truly was a pivotal point in our work. And there's one particular vignette that I talk about in which, once we did our own inner work where we recognized that the girls need to be in leadership and they wanted to have a party, and that it was steeped in this idea that, where they could see that there was there needs to be unity in the community, because there were so many narratives circulating around the community. And so we did that work of coming to, this consciousness as a collective, right? That to have this festival. And then when we started to plan the festival, there was resistance from because it's subsidized housing. So there was resistance from some of the other sort of official organizations connected to the community, like the housing and in this case also the police. And I had gotten an email from the chief of police when we had made a request. We were going to, we were shutting down a street and it was going to be a street festival and so forth. Yeah. And I had gotten this email from the police chief saying, you probably don't even know what you're doing. There's this neighborhood, there's all this feuding and, have you thought about this security? And I was just really shocked. I said, here's this whole narrative. And I knew going in that there was this narrative, as there are in many Black and brown communities. This not just a narrative. I mean, it's over policing. Yeah. And then they're create, that creates a particular narrative. Mm-hmm. But in this case, I printed out the email and Vanessa, who is a pseudonym of one of the S3 leaders, yeah, leading that meeting, I said, I want to share this with you, and she took the email and she said, okay, Dr. Parker, we've got some other things, we've got to get our games together. I mean, there was just this whole festive, atmosphere. And then she said, okay, Dr. Parker has brought us this email, and she reads the email from the police chief and it was really a surreal and powerful moment because as Vanessa, this young woman, she's 16 at the time, reading a narrative about her community. Yes. As the community is assembled there, representing all that is good about community as we think about community engagement and people who are planning something that is, founded on joy and unity and community change and moving forward. And so that was a powerful moment. And there was so much conversation about challenging that. Who is this person talking about? They're not talking about us. So seeing that contradiction. And out of that, the police chief actually came to the community. We decided to invite him to the community and then became a part of the planning. Anyway, so there's a little bit more to that story that I sort of tie to this complexity of policing and storytelling. But I think that the point is, and I do want to share this, that I draw heavily on a model that was developed by Leanne Bell, a colleague at Columbia University, and Kayan Irani, who is an artist and storyteller who also worked on that project. There's a model that's called storytelling for social justice. And it's a really wonderful way of thinking about this story that I just told, right? And put it in context. And so there are, according to this model, 4 types of stories. Yeah. One is the stock stories that basically reinforce the status quo. It's this dominant story. And, a really important understanding of social justice change is that whoever controls the narrative, is going to control the agenda, basically. It's like, so that's sort of our understandings of how things are or how things should be flow from stories that we think are that are the stock stories. Yeah. So those are the monuments that are on the landscape, the media, what kinds of stories are told in the media. Often those, if they're told from a dominant perspective, those are the stock stories. The flip side of stock stories are concealed stories. Yeah. And those are the stories, for example, as we are, tragically living for the last 100 or 200 years of, sort of policing of Black bodies and the killing of Black men and women, at the hands of police. Yes. Often those are concealed stories. So they're stories that circulate in communities and it was the kinds of stories that Ella Baker was encountering in the Jim Crow South, right? Of the stories of that were on the flip side of those stock stories. And so that's what we were seeing in this community, is this of starting to think about, they're the concealed stories of trauma, but they're also concealed stories of triumph and joy and and just, oftentimes it's disheartening in terms of thinking about the narratives that are told about, for example, Black families, right?
Yes.
And in schooling, and the idea that the foundational questions that every family has, how to survive, how to eat, how to care for their children, that want the best for their children, that these are concealed stories that get, that are hidden from in the shadows of these stock stories. And so the other two stories are in, sort of more hopeful transition from those stories. That is to say, resistance stories, right? That of this tradition of people resisting oppression, and these are the stories that are passed down, like bridge leadership, where you have those tools that can help us in our current, in current movements. And hopefully those lead to emerging or transformative stories, the new stories. And I think that that's what Ella Baker's approach was about catalyzing individual roots. It could take just one person who has this analysis, who's living through this sort of concealed story, resisting and, sort of catalyzing this broader impact through their activism.
Yeah, and transforming the story. Yeah, so powerful. We do have a question from an audience member. So, as discussed in your book, Pat, Ella Baker insisted on grassroots leadership by highlighting that Martin, MLK, didn't make the movement, but that the movement made Martin. In the popular media, Black leadership is often associated with MLK and Malcolm and Obama. What can we learn from Ella Baker to change this narrative?
Well, I mean, that's a really great question because it really speaks to, sort of an ongoing trend, I think, in terms of thinking about movement. It's one of those stock stories, right? I mean, it's in the public consciousness about how leadership, how change happens, what kind of leadership happens. And so I think that what we learn from Ella Baker is what we're learning from others who are in communities that are doing this work. Like, you keep doing the work, you keep engaging with the people who have this analysis, who have the consciousness of how change happens, and keep growing those grassroots. And eventually, that kind of Ella Baker used to call it spade work. That kind of work will catch up with, sort of the larger narrative. And I think that that's what we see in so many of the cities. I was really heartened to see, for example, I mentioned this, actually, I was able to get this in just before my book went to production. I had a little coda, and it was really wonderful to see in Minneapolis, in the city where tragically George Floyd was murdered at the hand of Derek Chauvin, former police officer. As people started talking about police reform, I was heartened to see that the people who were talking about, the people who were in those positions of official, positions of power, referenced the community engagement work that had been happening for decades, that had not been acknowledged, and that they knew that was where they needed to go to start to, because that's where those solutions that had been already worked through, brought to the forefront. And so the people who had been toiling for so long, who stayed in the struggle, this is another
stay in the struggle.
that's right. This is Ella Baker's quote as well. The struggle is eternal, someone else carries on. So people who had that faith that this is what we need in our communities, and this is what change looks like. And now those tools were at the ready to be incorporated in, some really sweeping changes that happened almost immediately in the police department and policing in Minneapolis. There's still more work to do, of course. But that, I think, that's what it is. So it's not about, I think we need to have people saying that grassroots leadership is important to the movement. That's what I'm trying to amplify.
Right.
But I think what's most important is that grassroots leaders keep doing what they're doing and have that analysis of how it's connected to this long game of change, because its power is always reasserting itself in different ways. And so those tools will always be relevant, I think, for community change.
Yes. We have a few other questions here. This one sort of touches a little bit on what we were talking about when we were bringing participatory decision making into our organizations and units. So this question is asking, so you talk about Ella Baker's philosophy of praxis and participatory decision making, and how it must begin with a deep and radical analysis of how structural power is circulating through us. In this case, it was about working in communities. So yeah, bringing this philosophy into organizations and units that you lead. Yeah, I don't know if you have any more to add to that.
Well, yes. I mean, I think, you know, my previous response was about, you know, engaging, you know, with the diversity liaisons and engaging with people who had that power analysis. This is sort of bringing it back to maybe back home for me, right? In terms of, so as a department chair, and I'm stepping into a new leadership role, which is being the new director, the next director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities in the College of Arts and Sciences.
The first Black woman to do so, I will say, right?
That's absolutely right. The first Black woman.
Congratulations, Pat.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm really excited about building on the work that's already been done there in terms of thinking about, you know, the creating a space. Like, this is part of, to me, this is part of answering this question in terms of thinking about this, doing this deep, you know, sort of thinking about how structural power is operating.
Right.
You know, I think there has to be a space for people who are willing to have that kind of conversation, to work toward that kind of change, to, you know, to have a seat at the table, have a voice in the conversation. So, for example, as a Black woman, I often have had to assert myself into some conversations. But I think it's also, you know, there's an educational process that happens. So for me, the short answer to the question is create that space for education, so that people really understand what it looks like to recognize how power is circulating and operating to exclude, to gatekeep, right? I mean, this is how you recognize how power is operating, when there are mechanisms that keep people out without there being a rationale, for example, to show it, or any sort of deep you know, conversation or transparent. And it's really about transparency and decision making often is too. So I try to model that as a department chair, for example. I'll just speak to my current position. I model transparency and decision making. And I ask tough questions to people who should have the answer or should have the response. Right. I mean, to me, and oftentimes that's, you know, and Ella Baker was that way as well. To ask the question that kind of gets to this conversation about what we want to build together, right?
Yeah.
And I try to start with our agreed upon commitments. Values can be tricky because people can sort of think, you know, it becomes a language game of sorts. But when we think about our commitments, for example, as a public university, I start there.
Right.
And, you know, to what extent are we acting in contradiction to our commitments as a public university, as a department of communication is the, and as in terms of our stated mission, for example. And so it gets back to that 8-year-old philosophy again, right? If there's a contradiction, what accounts for the contradiction? I mean, it's just a question. And I think asking good questions is at the heart of doing that structural analysis. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Pat. Thinking about doing this work, and thinking about the Ella Baker quote, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." We know that Ella Baker worked relentlessly. Travel, membership drives for the NAACP, fundraising, building local campaigns, doing all of this work, traveling throughout the Jim Crow South. So I wonder if maybe we could talk a little bit about Ella Baker's biography, how she sort of came to doing this leadership, what was her childhood like, how did she emerge as a leader, and how she sort of lived and breathed this motto of we who believe in freedom cannot rest, and what we can take from that. I really like this chapter that you have about radical self-care, right? Do we work relentlessly, or do we find a way to take care of ourselves and rest? Does rest equal freedom? Is rest a pathway to freedom, right? Yeah, so maybe we can start a little bit with Ella and how she sort of came to this leadership, and then how we might think about self-care.
Yes, I mean, I love Ella Baker's biography. I mean, aspects of, I mean, there are multiple ways to get to her biography, and I've already mentioned Barbara Ransby as sort of the definitive biographer, but there are many others people have written about Ella Baker. But the first thing I want to say is that she was born on December 13th, and she died on December 13th. Wow. Yeah. So she was 83. She was born in 1903 and died in 1986. But she and in there's some traditions where that already sort of sort of situates her as sort of a special person, right, in some religious traditions, especially. But she was born in Norfolk, Virginia, but she was raised most of her life from age 7, I believe it was, in Littleton, North Carolina. And thankfully, there is a historical marker there that recognizes her. Her childhood home is there, but she she was raised very near where both sets of her grandparents, maternal and paternal grandparents, had been enslaved. And the other thing about her biography is that even as a young age, her grandfather, who was a beloved person in her life, was a minister and would often let her ride along with him. When he would go to, oftentimes they would go to different churches and so forth, and she sometimes would just sit right up there with him. And from that early age, I think even he recognized this leadership quality in her, right? Her capacity to speak her mind and to be, articulate and thoughtful. But she was also very much influenced by her mother, who was a leader in her own right, in the Baptist church. And there are many, we can talk about Black women's history, very much tied up in Black women's activism and their community engagement through the church, and talk a bit about that in my own history in terms of looking at how I came to this work in this community. But so Ella Baker was very much, I think, a product of her upbringing, having access to some privilege because her parents or grandparents had become landowners. on one side, one set of grandparents were landowners. The others were not, they weren't really a part of that. So she had access to the haves and the have-nots, even within our own community. And that's important because, early on, and Barbara Ransby is wonderful in detailing this, she developed this consciousness, this class consciousness, right? So, and a particular philosophy about what it means to engage with people who are living in vulnerable life situations.
Right.
On the one hand, there is some tradition, even still in the Black community, of charity, right? Of giving to and giving back.
Right.
But Ella Baker began to sort of hone this understanding of engagement, of seeing that these, people who are living through these situations are helping themselves as well, and they have something to bring to the conversation. So she developed that philosophy. She went to Shaw University. Before it was just a university. It was it was a boarding school. So she went away at age 14 to Shaw University at the boarding school. This was one of the elite places, for Black life and intellectual life, and Ella Baker was right in the middle of that. And she was an activist. She developed her activist voice while she was at Shaw, and that's important because years later, decades later, when the student when the student movement had started to take hold across the country, catalyzed by the actions of the students at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, the Greensboro Four, those sit-ins. It was Ella Baker who went back to her alma mater to convene this gathering and really influenced Dr. King. Dr. King was saying, hey, we need to get these young people under the umbrella of the SCLC, which was the organization that Ella Baker actually helped to co-found with Dr. King, the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition. And if it had not been for Ella Baker, there would be no SNCC as we know it, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was tenaciously committed to those young people having their own organizations. And, why do they need us? I think she said, I could just hear her saying this. And people who write about Ella Baker and who study her say that they come to sort of recognize her spirit. And I heard Barbara Ransby say that, and I definitely say that. So I don't want to take any liberties here by quoting Ella Baker, her voice, but she was quite a remarkable woman. And the fact that she made a name for herself and carved out a space for herself among, the male circles, right? I mean, Dr. King, it was Thurgood Marshall. There were all of these men who were the leaders in the patriarchy, of that time, of the movement. And I think having her, her mother as a role model and others, that you have to have a seat at the table and to ask those questions and to be a part of that change. And so I could say more about her biography. Let me just say this: when she graduated Shaw, she went to Harlem in the 1920s, and as you know, this was the height of the Harlem Renaissance. It's also the time where there was as she called it, a hotbed of radical thinking. There were all these intellectuals who were there, and even though she was college educated, was not able to get a position in her field. And she didn't want to be a teacher, as her mother had wanted her to go in education. She really did want to be, maybe in political science. She wanted to go to the University of Chicago, but didn't have the funds to do that.
Yeah.
In sociology. So she, but she made a way for herself and started this leadership in earnest in Harlem, where she really kind of found her voice as an activist and a leader.
Yeah. Thank you, Pat, so much. This has been such an enjoyable conversation to learn more about Ella Baker, to read your book, to be in conversation with you. So thank you so much for this opportunity and taking the time to do this evening.
Well,
yeah.
It's my pleasure. I love talking about Ella Baker, and I'm inspired, as you can see, by her life and her work, and I hope others are as well.
I hope so. She's an inspirational person, as are you. So thank you. Elaine, please. I'm passing it to you.
Thank you. Dr. Parker, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful evening, and Ella Baker is just so inspirational. So I can't thank you enough. And Monica, thank you for moderating and asking such wonderful questions. And for those of you in the audience, I want to thank you for joining us. There are so many things going on, but you spent your evening with us, so I appreciate that. I just want to tell you about our next Well-Read event, and it's actually next Wednesday on June 2nd. We have Christy Woodson Harvey, class of 2007, and she will be talking about her new novel, Under the Southern Sky. So I want you to join us for that event if you can. I also want to invite you to get this book. I just looked it up. It's available at Flyleaf Books, but you can buy it anywhere else you can buy books, but I definitely recommend Flyleaf, which is right here in Chapel Hill. But yeah, you can read all about what we've talked today, and I definitely recommend it. And finally, if you want to learn more about the University Libraries, or if you'd like to make a gift in support of the University Libraries, please go to library.unc.edu, and you can scroll down to the bottom and you can find out everything that's going on in the University Libraries. So thank you again, Pat. Thank you, Monica. And thank